On this week's edition of New York Now, coronavirus and the courts. We'll have the latest information for you on the pandemic and how it's affecting New York's justice system. State Senator Brad Hoylman joins me via Skype with more on that and an update on the state budget.
What I have seen, though, is a very nimble court system overall.
Ambulance workers on the front lines of this crisis say they're running out of medical supplies. We'll speak with one of them. Plus, how does Medicaid play into all of this, and will the program prevent more federal funding for New York? And we'll have our weekly update from reporters at the state capitol with Karen DeWitt. I'm Dan Clark, and this is New York Now.
Funding for New York Now is provided by WNET.
Today, the Senate majority will pass
a law prohibiting it, and we will take them to court challenging it.
Yet another stand for New York and sending a message to the nation.
Welcome to this week's edition of New York Now. I'm Dan Clark. It's been less than a month since New York diagnosed its first case of the coronavirus, and life here has really changed. New York now has tens of thousands of cases of the disease, and there's no real sense of when the pandemic will end. Governor Andrew Cuomo said this week that it could be less than 3 weeks before the state's healthcare system is just completely overwhelmed by cases, and the death toll is expected to rise.
The most challenging point about the increasing numbers is where the numbers will apex. What is the high point of the numbers? And the apex is the point where we have to be able to manage the capacity. That rate of increase, that apex, they project at this time could be approximately 14 to 21 days away.
This disease has really touched every part of everyday life here in New York. That includes the state's courts, which have essentially closed for everything except critical matters. And even then, judges are now using technology to avoid appearing in court. State Senator Brad Hoylman chairs the Senate Judiciary Committee, which handles these types of issues. We spoke to him earlier this week via Skype. State Senator Brad Hoylman, thanks so much for joining us here on New York Now this week.
Thanks for having me, Dan.
So let's talk about something called the statute of limitations, because I feel like a lot of people probably don't know what that means. It's basically the time that you have when something happens, and then the time that you have to either charge someone with a crime or sue someone over that kind of deal. So you wrote a letter to the governor with a bunch of other Democrats in the Senate, maybe in the Assembly too, I'm not sure, asking for the statutes of limitations statewide on any crime or civil action, lawsuit, that kind of thing, to basically be put on pause. Tell me why you wanted that to happen, because as we now know, it's Wednesday when we're talking, it has happened. They have put everything on pause.
That's right, Dan. And the reason it's important is that, as you say, you're given a certain amount of time to file a claim, whether it's a civil or a criminal one, and that's important to preserve your rights as a litigant. And in this unusual time in which we find ourselves, where everything has been upended by this worldwide pandemic, it's not fair simply to cut off New Yorkers' time to file suits, whether they be criminal or civil. So we sent a letter on March 19th to the governor asking him to toll the statute of limitations, and he responded by doing so through an emergency gubernatorial directive the following day. So now prosecutors, litigants, attorneys, all have more time to file these types of claims.
This is such a huge deal that I feel like people who may not be involved or have some sort of civil claim that they might want to bring, people who just don't know about the legal system don't recognize how huge of a deal this is to really have everything put on pause and have that access to justice be waiting for you whenever the state decides to lift the pause of these statutes of limitations.
That leads into the second issue that I've been working on, which is the Child Victims Act. As you know,
Right.
I passed legislation with Assemblywoman Linda Rosenthal, and it gave adult survivors of child sexual abuse the opportunity to basically go back in time, even though the statute of limitations had expired, and file claims against their abusers or the litigants who may have protected them. Well, on March 23rd, the Office of Court Administration announced an end to all non-essential filings. So unfortunately, Child Victims Act filings are considered non-essential. So we're fighting now to extend the Child Victims Act look-back window by at least another year, because it's simply not fair that we promise these adult survivors of child sexual abuse 1 year to file these claims, but now their opportunity has been cut off by nearly 7 months, given the OCA directive to cut off all non-essential filings.
So you're also the Judiciary Chair in the Senate, which is a committee that deals with state courts, issues affecting lawyers and the legal system overall. How have you seen the state's courts change and adapt to this entire situation? I'm sure it's something that you've had your eye on. I'm curious how the legal system is really responding to this pandemic.
Well, some things change and some things don't change at all. There's still, believe it or not, ICE, concerns around courthouses. I'm hopeful that we can ban ICE from going to courthouses and around courthouses and arresting members of our immigrant community. But what I have seen, though, is a very nimble court system overall. The chief judge working with the chief administrative judge, Larry Marks, and the governor, and issuing these directives that preserve justice. And that's what we're talking about. As New York pauses, along with the rest of the nation, we need to make sure that nobody is disadvantaged from a legal and judicial standpoint. So that's what we're operating on in terms of proposing to the governor, fighting for items in the budget that, like the Protect Our Courts Act, that will ensure that justice is in fact available to New Yorkers during this extraordinary time.
Speaking of issues of justice, you have this bill. We talked about it. I think you were up here 2 weeks ago. It could be last week. I don't know. Time is escaping me right now. But you have this bill that would prevent price gouging on consumer goods during an emergency like this. Tell me about the bill, how you came up with it, and how it would benefit people.
Well, we saw at the beginning of the pandemic that folks were going to grocery stores and pharmacies and loading up on hand sanitizer and Tylenol. And not only were they doing that, but at the same time, the prices were raising by, 25% or 50% or more. There were bottles of hand sanitizer that were going for $25 for a small container.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's wrong. It's unfair. And that's why there are laws against gouging. Unfortunately, New York's anti-price gouging statute is rather vague. It limits these types of crimes, if you will, to a price point that is deemed unconscionable. So not only does this bill set a 10% bright line rule, but it also gives the Attorney General more powers to go after these price gougers. And that's so important during this time of scarcity and, unease in a lot of our communities where the lines, going outside of Trader Joe, wrap around the block. Seniors are having more difficulty getting their essential, medical items as a result. And everyone is concerned about, what the next weeks and months are going to bring.
So before I let you go, I have to talk to you about the state budget because it's due, by the time this airs, it'll be due in less than a week. And you have two big issues in it that you've been working on for a few years at least. So a ban on flavored vaping products and the legalization of gestational surrogacy. Two huge issues, both for you, the governor, and a lot of other Democrats in the legislature. Just quickly, can you give me an update on either of those? Have we seen any progress while everyone's kind of working remotely on this?
Well, for starters, on e-cigarettes and flavors, that's a very relevant topic. It's been relevant for several years now as we've seen the number of middle school and high schoolers who vape skyrocket. Well, we also know from preliminary studies that people who vape are more susceptible to COVID-19. And any prior lung injury, including what they call popcorn lung and other issues caused by vaping puts you at greater risk from the coronavirus. So I'm extremely hopeful, working with my Assembly colleagues and the Senate Health Chair, Gustavo Rivera, that we'll be able to ban the retail sale of all flavored vaping products in the budget. The second issue you mentioned, surrogacy, is also on the table, I'm happy to say, still at this point. Now, granted, this table sometimes is lopsided, so things slide off. But as I know it today, it's still being discussed with the Assembly and Senate leadership and the governor. The Senate has supported my legislation to legalize compensated surrogacy agreements and give LGBTQ New Yorkers and people who struggle with infertility the opportunity to have children.
All right, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much, State Senator Brad Homan, for joining us via Skype for New York Now this week.
Thanks for having me, Dan, and stay safe, wash your hands, and we're doing social distancing as we speak.
We have an extended version of that interview online. You'll notice tonight that most of our entire show is being done via Skype. That's to keep everyone safe, ourselves included. We usually bring you a reporter's roundtable every week, but this week we decided to call up our own Karen DeWitt for an update. Karen, thanks so much for joining us here. You're at the state capitol for our little digital version of our reporter roundtable this week.
That's right. At my offices in the reporters section called the LCA, very few reporters here and very few people in the Capitol because it's closed to visitors. The legislature isn't here. It's actually a little bit eerie, all these empty hallways.
I know that the days that I've been down there this week, it's been abnormal to see nobody here on a Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, so close to when the state budget is due, of course, in a few days at the end of March. Let's talk about what the governor has had his mind on this past week. And I think the big thing is ventilators. He's saying that we're going to need 30,000, 40,000 ventilators for these patients afflicted with COVID-19. Tell me what he's been saying over the past week and how people have been responding to it.
Well, you know, that's everybody's worst nightmare, that you're going to get this virus, you're not going to be able to breathe, you're going to go to the hospital, and there aren't going to be enough ventilators. So the governor is pretty desperate to get his hands on enough ventilators. As you said, he needs 30,000. He's gotten about 15,000. The state had 4,000. The federal government gave us 4,000, and the state purchased 7,000. So they're halfway there, but really it's a race against time because they expect the virus to peak in a very few short weeks, and they need to get their hands on them. There's reports that Tesla, the Solar City factory, the troubled Solar City factory in Buffalo, might be able to ramp up and produce some. But because there isn't a really organized federal effort, the governor's just trying to really put it together on the fly, day by day.
Well, he has been working sort of in tandem with the president, sort of. He talks with the president. This week we kind of had a hot and cold relationship between the two of them. What has he been saying about his working relationship with the president, since New York's the hot spot on this?
You know, he's been really careful not to provoke Trump. And I think he's trying to appeal to their common background. They're both from Queens. I mean, remember for decades, Donald Trump was a local New York City real estate developer who was a Democrat. And so he had a lot of common ties with Cuomo and the Cuomo family. They certainly knew each other, were, you know, somewhat in some of the same circles. So I think he's trying to appeal to that. Like, you know, look, Donald, this is your city too, and you got to care about it.
Are we seeing it pay off? Has the Trump administration responded in kind?
Well, you know, there was the 4,000 ventilators, which isn't that much, but I think he's just hoping that, you know, if he catches Trump on a good day, Trump will, you know, finally do some of the things that need to be done.
So in the backdrop of all of this, as we were talking at the start of this, is the state budget. And this is a huge mess every year. It's supposed to be $178 billion this year. And there were all these issues at the start, like marijuana, the legalization of surrogacy, a ban on flavored vaping products, and a whole host of other issues. What are you hearing on where we are in the state budget process? It's due on Tuesday, I think, is the 31st. So it's due next Tuesday.
Well, there aren't any agreements, but Governor Cuomo's saying, you know, I want these unrelated items in the budget because this might be it. the legislature might not be coming back this year. Certainly, I don't think they're going to be coming back this spring. So if those items don't get in the budget, like the adult use of recreational marijuana, legalizing that, making some changes to the bail reform laws, it's likely that they might not get done at all. And there's something interesting that the governor proposed on Thursday, that he wants to do a budget by the deadline and then revise it quarterly, count up essentially how much revenue is coming in, and then tell people like school districts and local governments, look, this is all the money we have. This is all you're going to get. And he sort of floated that proposal out. It almost seems like he doesn't have any choice but to do that.
Right. And I heard from the Senate on Thursday as well that they're really not pushing back on this idea. They're very open to it, especially given the economic uncertainty of where the state is.
Well, the Senate leader, Andrea Stewart-Cousins, said publicly in an interview on the public radio show, The Capitol Press Room, that she isn't open to that she doesn't want to cede control. But, it seems like they're going to have to. I don't know what choice they have. It might not be feasible for the legislature to come back, every few months and reevaluate the budget this year. They might have to give those powers over to the governor. But the thing is, with this governor, he's going to keep those powers in the future. So if they agree to it now, they're going to lose a lot of their leverage over the budget in future years.
Which is something that the legislature is not keen on doing these past few years. We have to leave it there, Karen. Thank you so much for taking the time from the state capitol. Karen DeWitt from New York State Public Radio.
Absolutely.
Thanks to Karen for the update. As we've told you in the last few weeks, a big problem with this pandemic is that there just aren't enough medical supplies to go around. That's what workers in hospitals are dealing with in places across the state. But ambulance workers are having the same problem. The United New York Ambulance Network recently sent a letter to the state asking for help. We spoke with the group's chair. Tom Coyle from the United New York Ambulance Network, thanks so much for joining us here on New York Now this week.
Thank you, Dan.
Absolutely. So you've sent this letter to the governor about the need for medical supplies for ambulance workers, which I think personally might be something that people have forgotten about in this whole pandemic crisis that we're in. Tell me about the supplies that your workers need.
Yeah, so, we're no different than the hospital systems. We need face masks, goggles, gowns, gloves. Currently we do have supplies, but we urge the governor to realize that EMS is on the front line and we need the supplies also, not just the hospital systems.
These seem like the kind of supplies that everybody is kind of grabbing for right now. There's a shortage globally with all of them. I mean, they're going to hospitals, they're going to ambulance workers, they're going to all sorts of healthcare professionals, as well as just people in the community that are facing this pandemic straight on. What can the state do, I guess, to make sure that these supplies are diverted not only to these hospital workers and these healthcare workers, but also to the ambulance workers that you represent?
Yeah, I think the state is doing what they can to get the supplies in. I think the important thing that we need to reiterate to the state is, we're on the front line. These supplies are also important to the EMS agencies throughout the state. Hospitals are important also. They're our partner, but we're on the front line and need the supplies just as bad.
So I want to ask you what might seem like a scary question, and I think it's kind of scary to a lot of people around the state that may have to call an ambulance and may have to be transported to the hospital. What happens when your workers run out of these supplies and there's none coming and they just don't have any of them to turn to?
Yeah, I mean, I'm hoping we don't get to that point. We currently have enough supplies to supply our industry currently, but with the peak, we know that our stock is running short, and we aren't going to stop responding, but we do worry about the safety of our personnel in the front line.
Before I let you go, I just want to ask you, so you sent this letter to the governor. Have you heard back at all?
We have not heard back from the governor. I have been in conversations with the State Bureau of EMS with similar conversations, but we have not had a response from the governor from the letter itself.
All right, well, let us know if you do, and we'll keep an eye on it. Tom Coyle from the United New York Ambulance Network, Thanks so much for joining us this week on New York Now.
Thank you, Dan.
There's also this big question of how Medicaid plays into the coronavirus pandemic. Members of Congress approved a bill last week to help states with the crisis, but Governor Andrew Cuomo says it won't do enough for New York State. Bill Hammond from the Empire Center for Public Policy joined us to explain. Bill Hammond from the Empire Center, thanks so much for joining us here on New York Now this week.
Pleased to be here.
So, Bill, I read some of your reporting on the Empire Center blog about how the governor is he's saying that his hands are basically tied in terms of Medicaid funding in relation to the coronavirus stimulus package from the federal government. We don't know exactly, we're talking here on Thursday or on Wednesday, we don't know exactly what that's going to look like in its final product. Can you kind of walk me through what Cuomo is saying in terms of his hands being tied when it comes to Medicaid?
Well, the stimulus legislation that's been passed so far in Washington, one of its main features has been an increase in Medicaid funding for all states, including New York. But it comes with some strings attached, and those strings say that states can't receive this money if they do certain things, if they make the Medicaid eligibility standards more restrictive than they were before the money started. And another issue for New York is that they said you can't receive this money if you're shifting Medicaid costs to counties, which the governor has said he wants to do. So the governor has characterized those strings as basically disqualifying the state, that we were left out of the bill, we're not eligible for any money. I think that's an overstatement. I think the governor has a point that those conditions would restrict the state's actions, his actions, and the legislature's actions and their ability to balance the Medicaid budget. But I don't think they completely cut New York State out.
So we're talking about, there's two parts of this. The governor wants to do his own kind of executive things in the state budget in terms of reformatting Medicaid. We're also talking about what's called the Medicaid Redesign Team, a panel that he convened this year to find $2.5 billion in savings. And I think it was a week ago, again, we're talking on Wednesday, it was about a week ago or maybe 2 weeks that they finally came up with the recommendations on how the state could save $2.5 billion in Medicaid. Give me kind of a brief overview of what people should know about the recommendations. Of course, they're not law, they have to be approved by the legislature, but tell me what they were looking at.
It includes just an across-the-board reduction in Medicaid rates of just under 1%, and that's going to save 200-something million. There's about $400 million in cuts in various payments and grant programs for hospitals. The largest area that that they're trying to save money on is long-term care, which is logical because that's an area that has been growing kind of rapidly and without unexpectedly, growing rapidly and unexpectedly in ways that state officials certainly didn't anticipate and did not want to happen.
With all of these hospitals dealing with this coronavirus situation, obviously they need to buy supplies, they're paying staff overtime. Did any of that factor into the decision, the recommendations by the Medicaid redesign team that we know of? Was there any consideration of the coronavirus pandemic?
When they announced the recommendations, they of course acknowledged the fact that the epidemic was going on and that things would need to change. But no, these recommendations really don't directly address that at all, and that does change things pretty dramatically. We had a significant shortfall in the Medicaid program before this pandemic hit. This pandemic is both increasing costs for the healthcare system, but it's also dramatically reducing revenue to the state. So the budget imbalance has gotten dramatically worse in just a couple of weeks. At least the outlook for that imbalance has gotten dramatically worse. Another kind of unpredictable factor is how much more we can expect from the federal government. We talked earlier about something like $4 to $6 billion in Medicaid funding. There's a new bill pending in Washington that would send us billions of dollars more. And so it's very difficult to know how all of this is going to balance out.
All right, we'll leave it there. Of course, Bill Hammond from the Empire Center, thanks so much for joining us here on New York Now this week.
Welcome.
That's all the time we have for tonight's show, but join us online every day. We're providing daily updates on the coronavirus from Albany on our website at nynow.org. And follow us on social media at nynow_PBS. Until then, thanks for watching this week's New York Now. Have a great week and be well.
Funding for New York Now is provided by WNET.